Let's begin, but before we do, a small request. Subscribe to the channel and leave your like, and tell me, where did you find me? It's always a pleasure to know who's on the other side. The silver tea service gleamed under the afternoon light streaming through the drawing room windows, each piece meticulously polished by Eleanor Hartwell's own hands that morning. She had risen before dawn, too excited to sleep, and had spent hours ensuring every detail of the evening's dinner would be perfect. 3 years, 3 long years of courtship, of stolen glances across crowded ballrooms, of carefully chaperoned walks through Hyde Park, of whispered promises beneath the gas lamps of London's fashionable squares. Tonight, William Ashford would finally ask her father for her hand in marriage. She knew it as certainly as she knew her own heartbeat. The Hartwell residence on Grosvenor Street was modest by aristocratic standards, but respectable, a testament to her father's success in the textile trade. The townhouse's red brick facade and white-trimmed windows spoke of solid middle-class prosperity, the kind earned through honest work rather than inherited titles. Eleanor's father, Thomas Hartwell, had built his business from nothing, and though they would never move in the highest circles of society, they were welcomed in many drawing rooms and counted among London's respectable merchant families. Eleanor adjusted the roses in the centerpiece for the 3rd time, their cream petals perfect against the dark mahogany of the dining table. Her mother, Margaret, watched from the doorway with an indulgent smile. "My dear, you'll wear those poor flowers to stems if you continue fussing," she said gently, her soft features creased with affection. At 45, Margaret Hartwell retained much of the beauty she'd passed to her daughter, the same chestnut hair, now streaked with silver, the same warm brown eyes that seemed to hold perpetual kindness. "I want everything to be perfect, Mama," Eleanor replied, stepping back to survey the room. The curtains had been cleaned, the silver polished until it reflected like mirrors, the crystal glasses arranged with mathematical precision. Even the fire in the grate had been laid with particular care, ready to provide warmth without excessive smoke. "It is perfect, darling, as are you." Margaret crossed the room and took her daughter's hands. "William is a fortunate man. I hope he knows that." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. At 23, she was past the first blush of youth by society's cruel standards, but her face held a refined beauty that had only deepened with maturity. Her figure, though not fashionably corseted to extremes, was graceful and elegant. More importantly, she possessed something rarer than physical beauty, a genuine warmth and intelligence that drew people to her. Catherine Sterling, her dearest friend since childhood, had always said that Eleanor had a gift for making everyone feel valued, from the grandest lady to the lowest servant. "He's been so patient," Eleanor said softly. 3 years is a long courtship, Mama. I know there were times Papa worried that William's intentions weren't serious, but I always knew. He was waiting until his circumstances improved, until he could offer me security. This was the story Eleanor had told herself during the long courtship. William Ashford came from good family. His grandfather had been a baronet, but the family fortune had dwindled through poor investments and his father's gambling debts. William worked as a clerk in a solicitor's office, respectable but not lucrative. He had been honest about his situation from the beginning, and Eleanor had admired his integrity. Unlike the fortune hunters who prowled London's ballrooms seeking heiresses, William had courted her for herself, despite her modest dowry, or so she believed. The afternoon crept toward evening with agonizing slowness. Eleanor changed into her finest dress, a gown of deep burgundy silk that her father had given her for her last birthday, the fabric from his own warehouses. The color brought out the warmth in her complexion and complemented the simple gold locket at her throat, a gift from William on their first anniversary of courtship. Inside the locket was a pressed violet, the flower he'd given her the day they met at the Sterling's garden party. By 7 o'clock the household was ready. Thomas Hartwell had returned from his offices, bathed and dressed in his evening clothes. The cook had prepared a feast: turtle soup, roasted pheasant, asparagus in butter sauce, and a magnificent trifle for dessert. The footman, they employed only one, but he was well trained, stood ready to serve. 7:30 came and went. Eleanor tried to ignore the first flutter of unease in her stomach. William was always punctual, sometimes arriving early. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked with aggressive volume in the waiting silence. Perhaps his work detained him, her father suggested, though his brow furrowed with concern. Thomas was a practical man who valued punctuality and kept promises. He had never been entirely comfortable with William's protracted courtship, though he'd held his tongue out of respect for his daughter's feelings. By 8 o'clock, Eleanor's hands were trembling. Her mother suggested they begin dinner without their guest, but the very idea made Eleanor feel ill. Something was wrong. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, a cold dread spreading through her chest like ice water. "I'll send Jenkins to his lodgings," her father announced, rising with decision. There must be some explanation, but before the footman could be summoned, there came a sharp knock at the door. Eleanor's heart leaped. She started to rise, but her mother's hand on her shoulder held her in place. "Let Jenkins answer it, dear. Compose yourself." Through the drawing-room door, left slightly ajar, Eleanor heard voices in the entrance hall. Not William's voice, but that of Mrs. Pemberton, their neighbour from 3 doors down. The woman was known for her love of gossip and her unfortunate habit of being first with any scandalous news. "I came as soon as I heard," Mrs. Pemberton's voice carried clearly, breathless with the excitement of being the bearer of shocking intelligence. "I thought you should know before you heard it from others." "Poor dear Eleanor." Eleanor was on her feet before she knew she'd moved, her mother's restraining hand too slow. She reached the hallway as Jenkins was attempting to turn Mrs. Pemberton away. The older woman's face was flushed, her eyes bright with malicious sympathy. The worst kind, the sympathy that feeds on others' misfortune. "What is it?" Eleanor demanded, her voice steadier than she felt. "What has happened?" Mrs. Pemberton's expression shifted to one of theatrical concern. "Oh, my dear girl, I'm so terribly sorry. I thought surely you would have been informed. William Ashford was married this afternoon at St. Mary's Church. A private ceremony, very sudden, to Miss Catherine Sterling." The words made no sense. They were English words strung together in proper order, but they produced only nonsense. William married to Catherine, her dearest friend, the woman who had listened to every hope and dream Eleanor had shared about her future with William, the woman who had helped her choose the burgundy dress she now wore, who had laughed with her about wedding plans and the names of future children. "That cannot be correct," Eleanor heard herself say, though her voice seemed to come from very far away. "There must be some mistake." "No mistake, I'm afraid. My husband witnessed the ceremony himself. He was at St. Mary's for another matter. Very rushed affair, no banns properly read, special license obtained. The groom seemed quite eager, and the bride—" Mrs. Pemberton paused for effect. "Well, one understands why. Catherine Sterling inherited a substantial fortune from her aunt in Devonshire just last week. £20,000, they say. Some say more." The floor tilted beneath Eleanor's feet. Her father's hand caught her elbow, steadying her. The entrance hall had become very bright and very far away, as if she were looking at it through the wrong end of a telescope. "That will be quite enough, Mrs. Pemberton." Thomas Hartwell's voice was steel wrapped in courtesy. "Jenkins, show the lady out." "I only thought—" "Good evening, madam." The door closed firmly. Eleanor stood in the sudden silence, aware of her mother's arms around her, of her father's grim face, of the cooling dinner in the dining room, and the roses she had arranged so carefully that afternoon. Every detail of the day, the polished silver, the pressed dress, the perfect table setting, now seemed like artifacts from another life, the life of a foolish girl who had believed in promises. "Sit down, my dear," her mother was saying, guiding her to the settee in the drawing-room. "There must be an explanation. Perhaps Mrs. Pemberton has her facts confused. You know how she exaggerates." But even as Margaret spoke the comforting words, her eyes met her husband's, and Eleanor saw the truth there. Her parents believed it. It was true. The night that followed existed in Eleanor's memory as a series of disconnected moments, like scenes from a play watched through a fog, her mother putting her to bed as if she were a child again, the sound of her father's angry pacing in the study below, the clock striking midnight, then 1, then 2, while Eleanor lay rigid in the darkness, her mind replaying every moment of the past 3 years, searching for the signs she had missed. William's excuses when she'd mentioned meeting his family. "They're quite old-fashioned, my dear. I'd rather wait until our engagement is official." His reluctance to attend certain social events. "I prefer our time together to be more intimate." His careful questions about Catherine's circumstances, which Eleanor had thought merely polite interest in her friend. "And Miss Sterling, has she any prospects? It must be difficult for her, an orphan without family." Catherine. The betrayal of William was devastating, but Catherine's treachery cut deeper. They had been friends since they were girls of 10, attending the same dame school, sharing secrets and dreams. When Catherine's parents died in a carriage accident 5 years ago, it had been the Hartwells who had taken her in for months, while her guardianship was settled. Eleanor had held Catherine while she wept, had sat with her through her grief, and Catherine had known. She must have known about William's intentions. The inheritance had come only a week ago, Mrs. Pemberton said. Had William approached Catherine immediately, or had they been meeting in secret all along? The questions circled in Eleanor's mind like vultures. Morning came eventually, as mornings do, indifferent to human suffering. Eleanor rose, dressed herself with mechanical precision, and came down to breakfast to find her father already at the table. The morning newspapers spread before him. He looked as if he hadn't slept. "There's a notice in the Times," he said quietly, folding the paper so she wouldn't have to see it. "The marriage is confirmed. No details of the bride's fortune, of course, but—" He shook his head. "I should have seen what he was. I should have protected you." "How could you have known, Papa?" Eleanor's voice was hollow. "I didn't know, and I was the one he courted, or pretended to court. He used you shamefully, kept you waiting while he searched for a better prospect." Thomas's hands clenched into fists on the table. "If I were a younger man, I'd call him out for this dishonor." "Papa, no." Eleanor reached across the table to cover his hand with hers. "That would only make the scandal worse. We must bear this with dignity." But dignity proved more difficult to maintain than Eleanor had imagined. By the afternoon, callers began arriving, some genuinely concerned, others merely curious to observe her humiliation firsthand. Mrs. Pemberton returned with more details. The bride had worn blue silk. The ceremony had lasted only 15 minutes. The couple was to reside in a fine house in Belgravia that William had secured on the strength of his new wife's fortune. Lady Ashcroft, a distant connection of the Hartwells through Eleanor's mother's family, was more direct than most. "You're well rid of him, my dear," she pronounced, settling her considerable bulk into the drawing-room's best chair. "A man who would behave so dishonorably is no loss, though I confess I'm shocked by Miss Sterling. I had thought her a gentlewoman." "As did I," Eleanor managed. "Still, you must be practical now. This will make your position difficult for a time. Society has little patience for jilted women. However unjust that may be, you must hold your head high and appear unaffected." After Lady Ashcroft departed, Eleanor retreated to her bedroom and allowed herself, finally, to weep. Not the delicate tears of a disappointed maiden, but great wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. She cried for her lost future, for her betrayed friendship, for the foolish girl she had been just yesterday, arranging roses and dreaming of happiness. The following days passed in a blur of similar visitors, pitying looks, and the subtle but unmistakable shift in how she was treated. Invitations that would have come as a matter of course now failed to arrive. When she did attend social functions with her mother, conversations would halt awkwardly at her approach. She saw the whispers behind fans, the speculative glances. The worst came a week after the wedding, when a letter arrived in Catherine's handwriting. Eleanor's mother brought it to her in the morning room, her face troubled. "You needn't read it if you don't wish to, darling." But Eleanor took the envelope, broke the seal and read, "Dearest Eleanor, I know you cannot forgive me, nor do I expect forgiveness. I can only ask that you try to understand. William approached me the day after my inheritance was confirmed. He was desperate. Creditors were threatening him. He faced debtor's prison. He confessed that he had been courting you in the hope that your father might assist him financially, but that he had realized it was impossible. He said he cared for you deeply, but that circumstances forced his hand. He offered me marriage, and I, God forgive me, I accepted. I have been alone so long, Eleanor. The years since my parents' death have been unbearable. The thought of a husband, a home, a position in society. I convinced myself that I was saving him, that I was being practical rather than romantic. I told myself you would understand eventually. I know now how deeply I have wronged you. I see it in William's eyes when he thinks I do not notice. He does not love me. Perhaps he loves no one but himself. I have what I wanted, a husband, security, a place in society. But I have lost what I valued most, your friendship and my own integrity. I do not ask for your forgiveness, only that you know I am sorry, more sorry than words can express. Your former friend, Catherine Eleanor, read the letter twice, then carried it to the fireplace and watched it burn. The words were perhaps sincere, but they changed nothing. Catherine had made her choice. William had revealed his true nature, and Eleanor was left to rebuild her life from the ruins of their betrayals. I will not attend any event where they might be present, Eleanor told her mother that evening. I cannot bear to see them, not yet, perhaps not ever. Margaret nodded sadly. That will limit your social opportunities considerably, my dear. They move in many of the same circles we do. Then I shall create new circles, or none at all, I care not. But as autumn turned to winter, Eleanor found that complete withdrawal was neither possible nor advisable. Her father's business required the family to maintain certain social connections. Her mother's charitable work with the church guild brought them into contact with many of the same families. Eleanor learned to endure the pitying glances, to hold her head high when entering rooms where whispers followed her passage. She became adept at changing the subject when well-meaning acquaintances asked about her prospects. She smiled at the tactless suggestions that she might still find a suitable husband. Many men prefer a woman of experience, my dear, even if that experience is unfortunate. She bore with dignity the subtle implication that she had somehow failed to secure William's affection, that his defection to Catherine reflected poorly on Eleanor's own attractions. The worst encounters were the accidental ones, glimpses of William and Catherine at the opera or walking in the park. Catherine always looked away quickly, her face flushing with shame. William, however, met Eleanor's eyes with something approaching defiance, as if daring her to make a scene. She never did. She would simply turn away and continue her conversation, though her hands would tremble for hours afterward. By winter's end, the acute pain had dulled to a persistent ache. Eleanor had learned to live with it, as one learns to live with any chronic injury. She threw herself into charitable work, visiting hospitals and orphanages with her mother. She read voraciously, educating herself on subjects far beyond the usual female accomplishments. She became, to her own surprise, content in a melancholy way, if not happy, at least at peace with her altered circumstances. It was in this state that she found herself, on a cold February evening, attending a benefit concert at the Covent Garden Theatre. The Covent Garden Theatre blazed with light and warmth against the February darkness, its grand neoclassical facade illuminated by hundreds of gas lamps. Eleanor had not wanted to attend. 6 months of half-mourning her lost future had left her with little appetite for society, but her mother had been insistent. The benefit was for the Hospital for Sick Children, a cause Margaret supported with passionate dedication, and Eleanor's absence would be noted and remarked upon. "You cannot hide forever, my dear," Margaret had said gently but firmly. "Life continues, whether we wish it to or not, and you have always cared deeply about helping those less fortunate. The children need our support, regardless of our personal troubles." So Eleanor had dressed carefully in a gown of deep grey silk, not quite mourning, but subdued enough to discourage excessive attention. She had arranged her hair simply and worn minimal jewelry. She had armed herself with dignity and determination, and she had come. The theatre's interior was magnificent, all red velvet and gilded ornament, with tier upon tier of boxes rising toward the painted ceiling. The stalls were filling with London's elite and wealthy, a glittering assembly of silk and jewels, of carefully cultivated elegance. Eleanor followed her parents to their seats in the upper circle, grateful they would not be in the prominent boxes, where every expression could be observed and analyzed. As they settled into their seats, Eleanor's eyes involuntarily scanned the crowd, searching for the two faces she most dreaded to see. There, in a box on the opposite side, Catherine sat beside William. Even at this distance, Eleanor could see that Catherine looked pale, her smile forced as she conversed with the occupants of the neighboring box. William, by contrast, appeared entirely at ease, resplendent in evening clothes that Eleanor recognized as far finer than anything he had worn during their courtship. His new wealth was evident in every detail of his appearance. Eleanor looked away quickly, forcing her attention to her program. She would not let them see her discomfort. She would not give them, or anyone else, the satisfaction of witnessing her distress. "Eleanor, dear," her mother murmured, "Lord Pembroke has just entered, do you see? With his wife and daughter. I've heard young Miss Pembroke will debut this season. Such a lovely girl." Eleanor dutifully looked toward the entrance where her mother indicated, grateful for the distraction. But her eyes were drawn instead to the figure who entered immediately after the Pembroke party, a tall man of perhaps 35, moving with unconscious authority through the crowded lobby. He wore his evening clothes with the casual perfection of one who had never needed to consider his appearance, as if elegance were as natural to him as breathing. "Good heavens," someone whispered behind Eleanor. "That's the Duke of Ashford. I heard he was back in England, but I didn't believe it. He hasn't been seen in London for years." "Alexander Blackwood," another voice confirmed. "They say he's even wealthier than his father was, if such a thing is possible. Made an absolute fortune in Indian railways and tea plantations. The richest peer in England, without question." Eleanor found herself watching as the Duke made his way through the crowd. People parted for him automatically, the men offering respectful nods, the women's eyes following him with poorly concealed interest. He acknowledged these attentions with polite but distant courtesy, making it clear he was not seeking conversation. He was handsome, Eleanor supposed, though not in William's soft, poetic way. His features were strong and angular, his dark hair touched with silver at the temples despite his relative youth. His eyes, even at this distance, were remarkable, an unusual shade of grey that seemed to miss nothing. There was something almost intimidating about him, an aura of power and intelligence that made even the most confident gentleman seem diminished in his presence. The Duke was escorted to a prominent box near the stage, the best in the house, naturally. He settled into his seat with what appeared to be complete indifference to the attention he attracted. A gentleman joined him, someone Eleanor didn't recognize, and they began a quiet conversation. "I remember when his father died," Lady Ashcroft's voice carried from the row behind Eleanor. 7 years ago now, must be. Young Blackwood left for India almost immediately after the funeral. There was talk he was running from scandal, though no one could quite agree what the scandal was. An affair, some said. Others claimed he'd had a falling out with his uncle. All I know is he abandoned English society entirely, buried himself in business concerns halfway around the world. "And now he's back," someone else responded, "with an even greater fortune than he left with. I wonder what brought him home." "Business, naturally. Everything with Blackwood is business. They say he has no heart at all, only a calculating machine where his emotions should be. Never been known to pay court to any woman, never shows interest in the usual pursuits of his class. Just works, invests, makes money." Eleanor found herself studying the Duke with unwelcome curiosity. He did look severe, she decided. There was no softness in his expression, no warmth in his bearing. He sat with perfect posture, his attention seemingly focused on his companion's words, but Eleanor had the distinct impression that he was aware of everything happening in the theatre, that those grey eyes missed no detail. As if feeling her gaze, the Duke suddenly looked up, directly at her. Eleanor froze. Even across the width of the theatre, she felt the impact of his regard. For a long moment, they simply looked at one another. Eleanor trapped by surprise, unable to look away. The Duke with an expression of, what, curiosity? Interest? It was impossible to read. Then he inclined his head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement so subtle that Eleanor wasn't certain it had actually occurred. She looked away quickly, her heart beating faster than the moment warranted. When she dared to glance back, he had returned his attention to his companion. "Did you see that?" her mother whispered. "I believe the Duke of Ashford just acknowledged you." "I'm sure it was nothing, Mama. He was likely looking at someone else." But Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she opened her fan. The Duke of Ashford had no reason to notice her, no reason to acknowledge her existence. They had never been introduced, moved in entirely different social spheres. It must have been coincidence, a random glance that happened to fall in her direction. The concert began shortly afterward, and Eleanor tried to lose herself in the music, Handel, Vivaldi, selections from Mozart, but she found her attention wandering, her eyes drawn repeatedly to the Duke's box. He sat perfectly still throughout the performance, his attention apparently focused on the stage. Yet there was something about his stillness that suggested tremendous energy held in check, like a powerful engine running silent. During the interval, the crowds moved to the lobbies and private reception rooms for refreshments. Eleanor would have preferred to remain in her seat, but her mother wanted to greet several acquaintances, and Eleanor had no choice but to follow. She kept to the periphery of the crowd, accepting a glass of lemonade from a passing servant, and positioning herself near a pillar where she might observe without being too prominent. She saw William and Catherine across the room, and immediately turned away, studying with sudden intensity the portrait of Garrick that hung on the nearby wall. She heard Catherine's voice rising above the general conversation, too bright and too loud, the voice of someone trying too hard to appear happy. "Eleanor." She turned to find Lady Pemberton approaching, her daughter in tow. The girl was perhaps 19, pretty in a conventional way, her expression sympathetic in the particularly irritating manner of the very young and very fortunate. "How brave of you to attend," Lady Pemberton said, her voice pitched to Carrie. "After everything you've endured. I said to Charlotte just this morning, didn't I, dear, that Eleanor Hartwell is the most courageous young woman in London, to hold your head high despite such disappointment. It's truly admirable." Eleanor smiled with lips that felt frozen. "You're very kind, Lady Pemberton. I'm quite well, I assure you." "Of course you are, dear. And who knows? Perhaps tonight will bring new opportunities. There are many eligible gentlemen present. Why, I'm certain—" But whatever Lady Pemberton was certain of remained unsaid, for at that moment the crowd near them stirred and parted. Eleanor looked up to see the Duke of Ashford approaching, moving through the assembly with that same casual authority she had noted earlier. People stepped aside for him automatically, and conversations faltered in his wake. He stopped directly before Eleanor, ignoring Lady Pemberton entirely. His eyes, they were grey, she confirmed, but not a cold grey, more like polished silver, intelligent and assessing, focused on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Forgive the intrusion." His voice was deep and cultured, with the kind of perfect diction that spoke of the finest education. "But I find myself at a disadvantage. We have not been introduced, yet I'm certain we should be. Alexander Blackwood, Duke of Ashford." Eleanor found her voice, though it sounded strange to her own ears. "Eleanor Hartwell, Your Grace." "Miss Hartwell." He pronounced her name as if testing its weight. "I wonder if I might impose upon you for an introduction to your parents. I have some acquaintance with your father's business reputation, and I find myself curious to meet the man who has built such a respected enterprise." It was smoothly done, Eleanor realized. By claiming interest in her father rather than in her specifically, he avoided any appearance of impropriety. Yet everyone within earshot would know that the Duke of Ashford, the richest peer in England, had sought her out specifically, had asked for an introduction. In the complex social calculus of London society, this simple request was a declaration of sorts. "Of course, Your Grace," Eleanor managed. "They would be honored." She led him through the crowd, acutely aware of the whispers that followed their passage, of the shocked faces and speculative glances. Her mother and father, engaged in conversation with the vicar and his wife near the refreshment table, looked up in surprise as Eleanor approached with the Duke at her side. "Mamma, Papa, may I present His Grace, the Duke of Ashford, Your Grace, my parents, Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Hartwell." The Duke bowed with perfect courtesy. "Mr. Hartwell, I'm delighted to make your acquaintance at last. Your innovations in textile manufacturing have not gone unnoticed, even in my remote corners of the world. I understand you've recently implemented a new weaving technique that promises to revolutionize production efficiency." Thomas Hartwell's surprise melted into pleasure. "Your Grace is remarkably well informed. Yes, we've been experimenting with a modified jacquard loom system. I wouldn't have expected such technical details to reach a gentleman of your position. I make it my business to know where the future lies, Mr. Hartwell. And the future, I'm convinced, lies increasingly in manufacturing and industry, not merely in land rents and government bonds. Men like yourself, who innovate and take calculated risks, are the true architects of England's prosperity." They fell into animated conversation about business and industry, and Eleanor found herself standing slightly apart, observing the Duke with new eyes. He was not at all what she had expected. His questions were intelligent and specific, demonstrating real knowledge rather than polite pretense. Her father, who could be reserved with aristocrats, warmed to him immediately, responding to the Duke's genuine interest with the enthusiasm he usually reserved for his closest business associates. "Your daughter, Mr. Hartwell," the Duke said eventually, turning to include Eleanor in the conversation. "Do you involve her in your business concerns? I've found that women often bring valuable perspectives to commercial matters, though society rarely acknowledges this." Thomas glanced at Eleanor with a mixture of surprise and pride. "Eleanor has always taken an interest in the business. She has a better head for figures than my son, if truth be told, though John would hate to hear me say so." "I'm not surprised," the Duke said, and his eyes met Eleanor's with an expression that seemed to see far more than she wished to reveal. "Intelligence is evident in more than words, Miss Hartwell. It's in how one observes, how one carries oneself through difficulty. These things cannot be hidden, at least not from those who know how to look." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. Was he referring to her situation with William? Did he know? Of course he knew. Everyone knew. The question was why he would mention it, however obliquely, in their first conversation. Before she could formulate a response, the bell rang to signal the second half of the concert was about to begin. The Duke bowed to her parents. "I've enjoyed our conversation immensely, Mr. Hartwell. Perhaps you would do me the honor of calling at my residence? I'm at Blackwood House in Mayfair. I have some business propositions I would very much like to discuss with you." "I would be delighted, Your Grace." The Duke turned to Eleanor. "Miss Hartwell, it has been a great pleasure. I hope we may speak again soon." He bowed and departed, leaving Eleanor standing with her parents amid a crowd of openly staring faces. Lady Pemberton looked as if she might faint from shock. Across the room, Eleanor saw Catherine watching with wide, confused eyes. William's expression was harder to read. Surprise, certainly, but also something that might have been concern. "Well," Thomas said quietly as they returned to their seats. "That was unexpected. Very unexpected," Margaret agreed, glancing at her daughter with an expression Eleanor couldn't quite interpret. "The Duke of Ashford doesn't speak to anyone without purpose. He never does anything without purpose, from what I've heard." Eleanor said nothing, but her mind was racing. The Duke's attention had been deliberate, public, and unmistakable. In the space of a single conversation, he had altered her social position, had made it clear that he found her and her family worthy of his notice. But why? What possible interest could the richest peer in England have in the daughter of a textile merchant, a woman marked by scandal and disappointment? The second half of the concert passed in a blur. Eleanor barely heard the music, her thoughts circling endlessly around the Duke's grey eyes, his careful words, the way he had looked at her as if seeing through all her carefully constructed defences to something underneath. When they finally departed the theatre, stepping out into the cold February night, Eleanor felt as if the entire evening had been a strange dream. The Duke's carriage, an elegant affair with a ducal crest on the door, was pulling away from the curb as they emerged, and Eleanor caught a glimpse of his profile in the window, illuminated briefly by a street lamp. He was looking back at the theatre. Looking back, Eleanor realized with a start at her. Then the carriage turned a corner and was gone, leaving only the echo of wheels on cobblestones, and the persistent question, what did the Duke of Ashford want? 3 days after the concert, a letter arrived at the Hartwell residence on heavy cream paper, sealed with the Blackwood crest. Eleanor was in the morning room with her mother, working on embroidery for the church charity bazaar, when Jenkins brought the silver salver bearing the envelope. Her father was at his warehouses, as he was every weekday morning, overseeing the day's business. "For Mr. Hartwell," Jenkins intoned, "from His Grace the Duke of Ashford." Margaret set down her needlework immediately. "Thomas isn't expected back until this evening. Should we send it to him at the warehouse?" "The messenger said there was no urgency, madam. He would await Mr. Hartwell's reply at his convenience." After Jenkins departed, Margaret picked up the letter, turning it over in her hands. "I wonder what business the Duke wishes to discuss with your father." Eleanor tried to focus on her embroidery, but her fingers had gone clumsy. She had thought of little else but the Duke since the concert. His face appeared in her mind at odd moments, while pouring tea, while reading, while lying awake at night. She told herself it meant nothing, that he had probably forgotten their encounter entirely. Yet she couldn't shake the memory of his eyes on her, that assessing grey gaze that seemed to see everything. When Thomas returned that evening, he read the letter in his study, while Eleanor and her mother waited with poorly concealed curiosity in the drawing room. Finally he emerged, the letter still in his hand, his expression thoughtful. "The Duke wishes to discuss a potential investment in my business," he said slowly. "He's interested in funding an expansion of the mill operations, particularly the new weaving techniques. He proposes a partnership of sorts, his capital and connections in exchange for a share of the profits." "That's wonderful, Thomas," Margaret exclaimed. "Think of what such an association could mean for the business." "Indeed." But Thomas looked troubled. "Yet I wonder at his timing and his interest. I'm not naive enough to believe a man of his position seeks out partnerships with textile merchants without some ulterior motive." Eleanor felt her father's eyes on her and looked up from her needlework. "Papa, the Duke was very particular in his letter," Thomas said carefully. "He suggested that I bring you and your mother when I call at Blackwood House. He said that since his business proposition might affect the family's future, it was only proper that the family be consulted." A silence fell over the room. Eleanor's hands stilled on her embroidery. Her mother exchanged a long look with her father. "He's interested in Eleanor," Margaret said finally, her voice gentle. "You realize that, don't you, Thomas?" "I realize he may be. What I don't understand is why." Thomas came to sit beside Eleanor, taking her hand. "You're my daughter, and I love you more than life itself, but we must be realistic. The Duke of Ashford could have his pick of any woman in England, titled ladies, great heiresses, women of the highest social standing. Why would he pay particular attention to you?" Eleanor tried not to let the words sting, though they did. Her father meant no cruelty. He was merely stating obvious facts. "Perhaps he isn't interested in me at all, Papa. Perhaps you're reading too much into a simple business meeting." "Perhaps," Thomas said, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it. "Nevertheless, we shall call on him as requested. If nothing else, his business proposal deserves serious consideration. I've sent word that we'll attend him on Thursday afternoon." The days until Thursday passed with agonizing slowness. Eleanor found herself in a state of nervous anticipation that she couldn't quite justify. She told herself repeatedly that the Duke's interest was purely in her father's business, that any attention paid to her had been merely courtesy. Yet she caught herself standing before her wardrobe far too long, debating which dress to wear, or practicing conversations in her mind as she went about her daily tasks. Catherine sent another letter, which Eleanor burned unread. She heard through Lady Ashcroft that William had been seen at his club, drinking heavily and running up bills that his new wife's fortune was rapidly depleting. The gossip gave Eleanor no satisfaction. She had moved beyond anger into something colder and more final, a complete severing of whatever connection had once existed between them. Thursday arrived at last. Eleanor, dressed with particular care in a gown of deep blue silk that brought out the warmth of her complexion, styled her hair simply but elegantly, and wore her mother's pearl earrings. When she studied her reflection in the mirror, she saw a woman who looked composed and dignified, with no trace of the devastation that had consumed her months earlier. It was a good mask. She had learned to wear it well. Blackwood House stood in Mayfair, on one of the most prestigious squares in London. The townhouse was magnificent, 4 stories of pristine white Portland stone, with black iron railings and window boxes that would be full of flowers in spring. It wasn't the largest house on the square, but it was unquestionably the most elegant. Every detail speaking of wealth so old and secure, it required no ostentation. A footman in livery answered their knock and ushered them into an entrance hall that took Eleanor's breath away. Black and white marble floors, a sweeping staircase with an intricate brass balustrade, walls painted in soft grey and hung with what were unmistakably old master paintings. The effect was both grand and restrained, powerful and refined, much like the Duke himself. They were shown to a drawing room on the first floor, where the Duke rose to greet them. He wore a dark grey suit that fit him perfectly, and Eleanor noted that he was even taller than she had remembered, easily over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and an athletic build that spoke of physical activity beyond the usual aristocratic pursuits. "Mr. Hartwell, Mrs. Hartwell, Miss Hartwell," he bowed to each in turn. "Thank you for accepting my invitation. Please do sit. I've taken the liberty of ordering tea." The room was beautiful. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the square, walls lined with books, comfortable furniture upholstered in rich fabrics. It felt like a room that was actually used, not merely a showpiece. Papers were scattered on a desk near the window, and Eleanor glimpsed what looked like architectural drawings and financial ledgers. Tea arrived, served by a butler of impressive dignity. The Duke played host with easy courtesy, ensuring everyone was comfortable before turning to business. "Mr. Hartwell, I'll be direct. I've been studying the textile industry for some time now, and I believe it represents one of the most significant opportunities for growth in the coming decades. The innovations you've pioneered with your modified looms could be scaled dramatically with proper investment. I'm prepared to offer substantial capital, £50,000 initially, in exchange for a partnership arrangement." Thomas nearly choked on his tea. £50,000 was an enormous sum, more than his entire business was currently worth. "Your Grace is extremely generous, but I must ask, why? There are surely larger manufacturers, more established concerns that would welcome your investment." "There are," the Duke agreed, "but they lack your particular combination of innovation and integrity. I've made inquiries about you, Mr. Hartwell, extensive inquiries. Every report confirms that you're a man who keeps his word, treats his workers fairly, and possesses genuine vision for the future of your industry. These qualities are rarer than you might think, particularly in combination." He turned then to look at Eleanor, and she felt the full force of his attention like a physical thing. "Moreover, I've learned that you've raised your children to share these values. Intelligence, integrity, and compassion, these are the qualities I value above all others." The implication was unmistakable. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks, but forced herself to meet his gaze steadily. She would not look away, would not show weakness before this man who seemed to see through every defense. "You speak of me as if I were part of this business arrangement, Your Grace," she said, her voice calmer than she felt. "I'm merely my father's daughter, not a partner in his concerns." "Aren't you?" The Duke's expression was unreadable. "From what I understand, you keep his books, review his contracts, and advised him on the loan terms that allowed him to expand his operations 3 years ago. That sounds rather like a partner to me, regardless of official titles. Eleanor stared at him in astonishment. How could he possibly know such details? Her father looked equally surprised. "Your Grace has been remarkably thorough in his inquiries," Thomas said slowly. "I always am, Mr. Hartwell. When I consider an investment of any kind, I ensure I have all relevant information." The Duke paused, then added with what might have been the ghost of a smile, "I believe in understanding exactly what I'm investing in and why it's worth the investment." The conversation turned to specifics of the business proposal, production capacities, market projections, distribution networks. Eleanor listened with genuine interest, occasionally offering observations when her father deferred to her knowledge of certain details. The Duke, she noticed, seemed to pay particular attention when she spoke, his questions directed as often to her as to her father. As the discussion continued, Eleanor found herself revising her initial impression of the Duke. He wasn't cold, as Lady Ashcroft had suggested. Rather, he was controlled, disciplined, every word and gesture measured and purposeful. But beneath that control, she sensed something else. A keen intelligence, yes, but also a depth of feeling that he kept carefully guarded. She recognized it because she had been doing the same thing herself for months. After nearly 2 hours, the business portion of the discussion concluded. The Duke suggested he would have his solicitors draw up formal proposals, which Mr. Hartwell could review at his leisure. "There's no rush," the Duke said. "I want you to be entirely comfortable with any arrangement we make. Take whatever time you need." As they prepared to depart, the Duke turned to Eleanor's mother. "Mrs. Hartwell, I wonder if I might impose upon you for a favor. I'm hosting a small dinner party next week, merely a dozen or so guests, nothing formal. I find myself in need of a hostess. As my sister is currently abroad, would you and your daughter consider assisting me? Mr. Hartwell would be most welcome as well, of course." It was smoothly done, Eleanor realized. By asking her mother to serve as hostess, he made the invitation entirely proper, while ensuring Eleanor's presence. Margaret glanced at her daughter before responding. "We would be honored, Your Grace." "Excellent. Shall we say next Wednesday, 7 o'clock? In the carriage home, Thomas was silent for a long while, staring out the window at the passing streets. Finally, he spoke. "He wants to court you, Eleanor. Make no mistake about that. The business proposal is genuine, but it's also a means to an end." "Thomas," Margaret said gently, "we don't know that for certain, don't we?" He looked at his daughter with troubled eyes. "Eleanor, you must understand something. The Duke of Ashford is not William Ashford. He is a man of immense power and wealth, accustomed to getting what he wants. If he has decided to pursue you, it will be with the same calculation and strategy he applies to his business affairs." "Perhaps," Eleanor said quietly. "But Papa, I'm not the naive girl I was 6 months ago. I won't be deceived by pretty words and empty promises again. If the Duke is interested in me, and I'm not convinced he is, then he'll find me a rather different prospect than he might expect." Thomas smiled despite his concerns. "I don't doubt that, my dear. You've grown stronger these past months. Sadder, which grieves me, but stronger. Just be careful. Men like the Duke are dangerous in ways that men like William could never be. They don't merely break hearts. They consume them entirely." Eleanor thought about this as they rode home through the London streets. Was her father right? Did the Duke intend to court her? And if so, why? She wasn't beautiful enough to turn heads in a ballroom, wasn't connected enough to enhance his social position, wasn't wealthy enough to increase his fortune. By every conventional measure, she was entirely unsuitable as a match for England's richest peer. Yet she couldn't deny that something had passed between them in that drawing room, a recognition, an understanding. He had looked at her as if seeing someone he knew, though they had only just met, and she had felt it too, that strange sense of familiarity, as if she were speaking with someone who understood her in ways that most people never would. It was unsettling, it was intriguing, and it was, Eleanor realized with a start, the first time since William's betrayal that she had felt anything other than pain or numbness. Whether that was a good thing or a dangerous thing remained to be seen. The Duke's dinner party was everything Eleanor expected, and nothing like she feared. She had anticipated a grand, intimidating affair. Dozens of aristocrats in a massive, formal dining room, all of them judging the textile merchant's daughter, who had somehow caught the Duke's attention. Instead, she found an intimate gathering in a surprisingly warm and comfortable space. The dining room at Blackwood House was smaller than the formal stateroom on the floor below. The table, though finely appointed, seated only 14. The other guests were an eclectic mix: a member of Parliament and his wife, a prominent banker, a scholar from Cambridge, a successful novelist, and several other individuals who seemed chosen more for their interesting conversation than their social rank. Eleanor's mother served as hostess with natural grace, seated at the foot of the table while the Duke presided at the head. Eleanor found herself placed at the Duke's right hand, the traditional position of honor. On her other side sat the novelist, a woman named Mrs. Patterson, who proved to be delightfully sharp-witted and entirely lacking in social pretension. "You must be someone quite special," Mrs. Patterson murmured to Eleanor as the first course was served. "The Duke never entertains. I've known him for 5 years, and this is only the second time I've been invited to his home. He claims social obligations bore him to tears, and he only endures them when absolutely necessary." Eleanor glanced at the Duke, who was engaged in conversation with the banker. Perhaps he's trying to be more social. Perhaps he has a specific reason for gathering these particular people tonight. Mrs. Patterson's eyes twinkled with amusement. "I've noticed that everyone here is someone who values substance over form, people who have earned their positions rather than inherited them, or who have accomplished something meaningful in their fields. Except for Lady Pembroke, but I suspect she's here because her husband is useful to the Duke's business interests." The dinner conversation was unlike any Eleanor had experienced in London society. Instead of the usual gossip and small talk, the guests discussed politics, literature, scientific advances, and social reform. The Duke guided the conversation with subtle skill, drawing out each guest's particular expertise and ensuring everyone contributed. When the topic turned to the condition of workers in factories, Eleanor found herself speaking before she could think better of it. "The problem isn't merely wages," she said, responding to a comment from the MP. "It's the conditions themselves. Children working 14-hour days in dangerous environments, families living in squalor because they can't afford both rent and food. Higher wages help, certainly, but we need broader reforms. Safety standards, limits on working hours, education requirements." She realized the table had gone quiet and looked up to find everyone watching her. Heat rose to her cheeks. "Forgive me. I didn't mean to lecture." "Sir, please don't apologize," the Duke said, his grey eyes fixed on her with that intense focus she was beginning to recognize. "You're quite right. I've seen similar conditions in India, and I've made it a practice to ensure my own business interests maintain higher standards. But individual efforts aren't enough. We need legislative change, which requires political will." He turned to the MP. "Sir Robert, what's your view on factory reform legislation?" The conversation flowed on, but Eleanor felt the Duke's attention even when he wasn't looking directly at her. It was as if she had passed some kind of test, though she couldn't quite identify what the test had been. After dinner, the ladies withdrew to the drawing room while the men remained for port and cigars. Eleanor expected the usual feminine chit-chat, but Mrs. Patterson immediately engaged her in a discussion about women's education, and the evening continued to be far more interesting than she had anticipated. When the men rejoined them, the Duke approached Eleanor directly. "Miss Hartwell, would you do me the honor of taking a turn about the room? I'd like to show you something." With her mother's approving nod, Eleanor accepted his offered arm. He guided her to a quieter corner of the drawing room, where a painting hung between two windows. "This is a Turner," he said, indicating the landscape. "One of his earlier works before he became famous. I purchased it years ago because something about it spoke to me. The way he captured the light breaking through storm clouds, hope emerging from darkness." Eleanor studied the painting. It was beautiful, moody and atmospheric, with that distinctive Turner luminosity. "It's lovely, Your Grace." "Alexander." She looked at him in surprise. "I beg your pardon? My name is Alexander, and I would like very much if you would use it, at least when we're in relatively private conversation." He paused, then added, "May I call you Eleanor?" It was an intimacy that proper society would frown upon, given their short acquaintance. Yet Eleanor found herself nodding. "If you wish, Alexander." His name felt strange on her tongue, too familiar, and yet somehow right. He smiled. A real smile this time, not the polite social expression he'd worn all evening, but something genuine that transformed his severe features into something almost boyish. "Thank you. I'm not much for social conventions, Eleanor. I find them tedious and often meaningless. I prefer directness when circumstances permit." "Then I shall be direct," Eleanor said, surprising herself with her boldness. "Why am I here? Why this dinner party? Why the attention you've shown my family? My father believes you're courting me, but I can't fathom why. You could have your choice of any woman in England." Alexander's smile faded, replaced by that serious, assessing expression. You want honesty? Very well, I attended that concert 3 weeks ago because a business associate insisted I needed to be more visible in London society. I was bored within minutes. Then I looked across the theatre and saw you. Me? Eleanor's voice came out more breathless than she intended. You, sitting in the upper circle wearing a grey dress, looking as if you'd rather be anywhere else. But you held your head high. You maintained perfect composure even when I saw you catch sight of someone. I later learned it was the man who jilted you, and I watched your hands tremble on your program, even as your face remained serene. I thought, here is someone who has been wounded but refuses to break. Someone with real strength, not merely social performance. Eleanor felt exposed, as if he had seen through her carefully constructed defenses to the raw pain beneath. You investigated me. I did, thoroughly. I learned about William Ashford and his mercenary marriage to your friend. I learned about how you've conducted yourself since, with dignity and grace, never speaking ill of those who wronged you, never seeking sympathy or revenge. I learned about your intelligence, your charity work, your devotion to your family. He paused, his grey eyes holding hers. And I decided that you were someone worth knowing, someone who deserved better than she'd received. So this is pity? Eleanor's voice hardened. You feel sorry for the jilted girl and wish to, what? Restore her reputation by showing her attention? No. The word was sharp, almost angry. This is not pity, Eleanor. Pity is what those social vultures at the theatre showed you, those women who whispered behind their fans about poor Miss Hartwell. I don't pity you. I admire you. There's a considerable difference. Eleanor found she was trembling, though whether from anger or something else she couldn't say. And the business proposal to my father? Is that part of this admiration? The business proposal is genuine and entirely separate. Your father's innovations are sound and I believe the investment will be profitable. But yes, I'll admit it serves a dual purpose. It gives me a reason to know your family, to see you in circumstances that society considers appropriate. He took a step closer, his voice dropping lower. Eleanor, I'm not a romantic man. I don't believe in love at first sight or poetic passion, but I believe in recognizing value when I see it. You have qualities I respect. Intelligence, resilience, integrity. I would like very much to know you better, to see if the compatibility I suspect exists between us is real. And if I don't want to be known better? Eleanor asked, though her voice lacked conviction. If I prefer to be left alone with my wounded pride and my cautious heart, then I'll respect that decision and limit our interactions to those required by my business with your father. Alexander's expression was serious, almost somber. I won't pursue where I'm not welcome, Eleanor. I'm not William Ashford, offering pretty lies and empty promises. Everything I've told you tonight is truth. What you do with that truth is entirely your choice. Eleanor looked away from his intense gaze, her eyes falling on the Turner painting. Hope emerging from darkness. Was that what Alexander was offering? Or was she simply replacing one heartbreak with another, trading William's shallow charm for Alexander's calculated interest? I don't know what I want, she admitted finally. I thought I knew once. I thought I understood my heart and what would make me happy. I was catastrophically wrong. How can I trust my judgment now? Perhaps you can't, Alexander said quietly. Perhaps trust is something that must be earned slowly, through actions rather than words. I'm a patient man, Eleanor. I can wait while you decide whether I'm worthy of your trust. Before Eleanor could respond, Mrs. Patterson's voice called from across the room. Miss Hartwell, you must settle a debate for us. The professor insists that Shakespeare's sonnets are superior to Donne's poetry, but I maintain that metaphysical wit trumps mere lyricism. What's your opinion? Eleanor glanced at Alexander, who smiled and gestured for her to return to the company. As she walked away, she felt his eyes following her, and she knew with absolute certainty that her life had just become infinitely more complicated. The evening concluded shortly afterward. As the Hartwells prepared to depart, Alexander held Eleanor's hand perhaps a moment longer than propriety demanded. Thank you for coming tonight, he said, for being honest with me, and for allowing me to be honest with you. I hope we'll speak again soon. I expect we will, Eleanor replied, given your business with my father. Yes, a slight smile. Convenient, isn't it? In the carriage home, Margaret squeezed her daughter's hand. He's quite remarkable, isn't he? Not at all what the gossip suggested. No, Eleanor agreed. Not at all what I expected. Be careful, darling, her mother said softly. Not because I fear he'll hurt you intentionally. I don't believe he would. But men of such power and intensity can be overwhelming. Don't let yourself be swept away before you're ready. Eleanor nodded, but she wondered if it was already too late. Alexander Blackwood had appeared in her life like a storm, unexpected, powerful, and impossible to ignore. Whether he would prove to be destructive or transformative remained to be seen. Spring arrived in London with a burst of green in the parks and gardens, and with it came a subtle but unmistakable shift in Eleanor's social position. The Duke of Ashford's attention had not gone unnoticed. Invitations that had dried up after William's betrayal began arriving again. Women who had whispered about her behind their fans now sought her company. The transformation was both gratifying and somewhat nauseating. Eleanor hadn't changed, but society's perception of her had altered entirely based on one man's interest. Alexander had been true to his word about patience. He called regularly at the Hartwell residence, always with plausible reasons, discussing business with her father, bringing her mother information about a charity project, asking Eleanor's opinion on art or literature. He never pushed for more than she was willing to give, never demanded declarations or decisions. But his presence became a constant in her life. A week rarely passed without seeing him at least once, whether at a gallery opening, a lecture at the Royal Society, or simply taking tea in the Hartwell drawing room. He brought her books he thought she'd enjoy, engaged her in debates about politics and philosophy, listened with genuine interest when she spoke about her charity work with the hospitals. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Eleanor found her guard lowering. Alexander was not William. The differences became more apparent with every interaction. Where William had been charming but shallow, Alexander was serious but substantial. Where William had made grand romantic gestures that cost him nothing, Alexander showed his regard through thoughtful attentions and genuine interest in her thoughts and opinions. Where William had promised everything, Alexander promised nothing except honesty and respect. It was, Eleanor reflected one evening, as she dressed for yet another event where Alexander would be present, rather terrifying, because she was beginning to care for him, and caring meant vulnerability. Vulnerability meant the possibility of pain. The event in question was a ball at the Pembroke residence, one of the season's major social occasions. Eleanor had debated declining the invitation, but her mother had insisted. "You cannot hide forever, darling. And with the Duke's attention, you'll find this season very different from how it might have been." She was right. When Eleanor arrived with her parents, she found herself immediately surrounded by acquaintances eager to claim her attention. The difference from 6 months ago was stark and somewhat bitter. Where was this friendly interest when she had needed it most? When she was isolated and hurting, these same people had turned away. Now that the Duke of Ashford favoured her, they flocked like birds to grain. Alexander arrived fashionably late, causing the expected stir. Eleanor watched from across the ballroom as he made his way through the crowd, nodding politely to acquaintances, but clearly seeking someone. When his eyes found hers, his expression lightened perceptibly. He navigated directly to her side, ignoring several other ladies who tried to claim his attention. "Eleanor," he said, bowing over her hand, "how you look lovely this evening." She wore a gown of deep rose silk, more colourful than her usual subdued choices. Her mother had insisted she was done with half-mourning for a future that had never existed. "Thank you, Alexander, though I suspect you'd say that regardless of how I actually looked." "Would I? I'm not generally known for empty flattery." He smiled slightly. "Dance with me." It would be their first dance together, Eleanor realized. A public declaration of sorts. She hesitated only a moment before nodding. The waltz was just beginning as they took their places. Alexander's hand at her waist was firm and assured, his leading confident. Eleanor had forgotten how much she enjoyed dancing. It had been months since she'd accepted any invitations to take the floor. "You're tense," Alexander observed as they began to move. "Are you worried what people will think?" "Perhaps. This will be remarked upon." "Let them remark. I've found that people will gossip regardless of what one does or doesn't do. The only defense is not to care. Easy to say when you're a duke. More difficult when you're the subject of pitying whispers." "Are those whispers still pitying?" Alexander asked, guiding her through a turn. "Or have they shifted to something else, speculation about my intentions, perhaps?" Eleanor couldn't help but smile. "Definitely speculation. Lady Pemberton has asked me no fewer than 3 times if we're engaged. She's quite desperate to be first with the news." "And what do you tell her?" "That she'll have to continue speculating." They danced in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Alexander said quietly, "I've been patient, Eleanor. I said I could wait, and I can. But I think perhaps it's time for honesty between us." I want to court you properly, not these half measures of business calls and coincidental meetings. I want society to know I'm pursuing you, and I want you to know my intentions are serious. Eleanor's heart beat faster. And those intentions are? Marriage, eventually, if you'll have me. But I'm not proposing tonight. You're not ready, and I prefer not to rush important decisions. I'm simply asking permission to court you openly, to call on you regularly, to dance with you at balls, to escort you to events, to let the world see that I find you remarkable and worthy of my attention. It was the most unromantic declaration Eleanor could imagine, and yet somehow it meant more than any flowery speech would have. Alexander was offering her honesty and transparency, the very things William had never given. What if I'm not ready? She asked. What if I can't trust this, can't trust you, can't trust my own judgment? Then we proceed slowly until you are ready, or until you decide you never will be, in which case I'll withdraw gracefully. He met her eyes steadily. Eleanor, I won't lie to you. I'm a man accustomed to getting what I want, and I want you, but not against your will, not through manipulation or pressure. If you need time, take it. If you need space, I'll give it. But if you're willing to let me try to earn your trust, I'd very much like the opportunity. The waltz was ending. Around them, other couples were separating, moving off the floor. Eleanor and Alexander stood still for a moment, the crowd moving around them like water around stones. Yes, Eleanor said finally, you may court me, openly, honestly, but Alexander, if you hurt me, if you prove false, I won't recover a second time. I need you to understand that. His hand tightened briefly on hers. I understand, and I give you my word, which I have never broken, that I will not deceive you in anything. As they left the dance floor, Eleanor caught sight of William and Catherine standing near one of the pillars. Catherine looked away immediately, but William's face showed clear consternation. He had been watching them dance, Eleanor realized. He had seen the Duke of Ashford, the richest man in England, claim her as someone worthy of his regard, and William finally understood what he had thrown away. Eleanor felt nothing, no satisfaction, no vindication, not even lingering pain. William was simply irrelevant now, a figure from a past life that no longer touched her present. She had moved beyond him, without even noticing the moment when he ceased to matter. What are you thinking? Alexander asked quietly, as they made their way to the refreshment table. That I'm glad I wore the rose dress, Eleanor replied with a smile, and that perhaps the future isn't as frightening as I thought. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Eleanor had experienced in her life. Alexander courted her with an intensity that was both exhilarating and somewhat overwhelming. He called at the Hartwell residence nearly every day, sometimes for hours, sometimes for brief visits between his business obligations. He took her to museums and art galleries, to lectures and concerts, to Hyde Park for morning rides in his carriage. London society watched with fascination as the Duke of Ashford, previously immune to feminine charms, conducted a very public courtship. The betting books at the gentlemen's clubs filled with wagers about when he would propose. Mothers of eligible daughters mourned their lost opportunity. Gossip columnists penned breathless speculation about the romance. Eleanor tried to ignore the attention and focus on getting to know the man behind the title. Alexander, she discovered, was more complex than she had initially suspected. He was brilliant in business, almost ruthlessly so, but he applied his principles consistently. He refused investments in enterprises that exploited workers, insisted on fair dealing even when harder practices might be more profitable, and gave generously to causes he believed in. He was also surprisingly well-read and intellectually curious. Their conversations ranged across subjects Eleanor had never discussed with William: philosophy, science, political economy, social reform. Alexander seemed to delight in her opinions, even when they disagreed, which they often did. He challenged her thinking, pushed her to defend her positions, and conceded points when her arguments were stronger. But he was also guarded. Eleanor sensed walls around certain parts of his life, subjects he didn't wish to discuss. When she asked about his years in India, he spoke of business and administration, but never of personal matters. When she inquired about his family beyond his sister, he changed the subject smoothly. He was generous with his thoughts on nearly every topic, but carefully private about his emotions. It was during a visit to the British Museum, as they stood before the Elgin marbles, that Eleanor finally asked directly, "Why did you leave England 7 years ago?" Alexander was silent for a long moment, studying the ancient Greek sculptures. Finally he said, "My father died. I didn't handle it well." "How you were close to him?" "Very. He was a good man, better than most realize, Fair, principled, genuinely caring about the people who depended on him. Everything a duke should be and often isn't. Alexander's voice was carefully neutral, but Eleanor heard the pain beneath it. When he died, suddenly and unexpectedly, I found myself with a title I wasn't ready for, responsibilities I didn't want, and a grief I couldn't process properly. So you left? So I fled, to be honest about it. Went to India, buried myself in work, in building and managing the business interests there. It was easier than staying in England, facing the places and people that reminded me of him. He turned to look at her. It wasn't my finest moment. Running away rarely is. But you came back. I did, because eventually you have to face what you've been avoiding. And because I realized I was becoming someone my father wouldn't have recognized. All work and calculation, no softness, no connection to anything or anyone. He paused. And then I saw you at that concert, and I thought perhaps it wasn't too late to remember how to be human. Eleanor's throat tightened. I'm not sure I'm qualified to teach anyone that. I've been rather focused on protecting myself, building walls. Perhaps we can learn together. Two wounded people figuring out how to open up again. It was in moments like these that Eleanor felt her resistance crumbling. Alexander wasn't offering her fairy tale romance or unrealistic perfection. He was offering partnership, honesty, mutual growth. It was real in a way William's courtship had never been, but always in the back of her mind was the fear. What if she was wrong again? What if she was seeing what she wanted to see rather than what was real? What if Alexander's patient courtship was just another, more sophisticated form of deception? As spring progressed towards summer, the question of marriage became increasingly present in every conversation. Alexander never pushed, never demanded an answer, but Eleanor knew he was waiting. Society was waiting. Even her own parents were gently inquiring when she might make a decision. It was her father who finally forced the issue. Thomas Hartwell called Eleanor into his study one evening in late May and closed the door carefully. "Sit down, my dear. We need to have a serious conversation." Eleanor sat, suddenly anxious. Her father's expression was grave. "The Duke has asked my permission to propose to you," Thomas said without preamble. "Formally, properly. He came to my office this afternoon." Eleanor's heart began to race. "And what did you tell him?" "That the decision was yours entirely, but that he had my blessing if you chose to accept him." Thomas leaned forward, his hands clasped on his desk. "Eleanor, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Do you love him?" The question hung in the air. Did she love Alexander? Eleanor had been avoiding examining her feelings too closely, afraid of what she might find. "I don't know," she admitted. "I care for him. I respect him enormously. I enjoy his company more than anyone else I've ever known. When he's not here, I find myself thinking about him, looking forward to his next visit. But is that love, or just gratitude, attraction, the desire not to be alone? I can't answer that for you, my dear. Only you know your own heart." Thomas paused, then added, "But I will say this. What you've just described sounds very much like love to me. Not the passionate infatuation you felt for William. That was never love, though I know you believed it was. This sounds like something deeper, more solid. But what if I'm wrong? What if I accept him and then discover that he's human, that he has flaws, that marriage is work and compromise rather than constant happiness?" Thomas smiled gently. "My dear, every marriage involves those discoveries. The question isn't whether he's perfect. No one is. The question is whether you can imagine building a life with him, facing challenges together, growing together. Can you?" Eleanor thought about Alexander, his intensity, his intelligence, the way he looked at her as if she were the most fascinating person in the world. She thought about his honesty, his values, his willingness to be vulnerable with her. She thought about how different she felt with him compared to how she'd felt with William, less anxious to please, more fully herself. "Yes," she said slowly, "I think I can. But Papa, I'm still afraid." "That's because you're intelligent enough to know that opening your heart involves risk. But Eleanor, you can't live your whole life in fear of being hurt. At some point, you have to decide whether the possibility of happiness is worth the risk of pain." That night, Eleanor lay awake for hours, thinking about her father's words. Alexander would propose soon, probably within days. What would her answer be? She thought about William and Catherine, and realized with sudden clarity that she had never really loved William. She had loved the idea of being in love, loved having someone court her, loved the future she had imagined. But William himself, his character, his mind, his soul, She had never truly known him. She had been in love with a fantasy. What she felt for Alexander was entirely different. She knew him, his strengths and his flaws, his brilliance and his guardedness, his principles and his ruthlessness in business. She had seen him angry, thoughtful, amused, serious, vulnerable, and she cared for him not despite these complexities, but because of them. That was love, Eleanor realized. Not the easy emotion she'd felt for William, but something harder won and more valuable. Love earned through knowing someone fully and choosing them anyway. The question was whether she was brave enough to admit it. The proposal came 3 days later, in the most unexpected way. Eleanor had assumed Alexander would choose some grand romantic setting, a ball perhaps, or a garden party, somewhere public and notable. Instead, he appeared at the Hartwell residence on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, when Eleanor was alone in the morning room working on correspondence. Jenkins announced him with barely concealed excitement. Alexander entered, his coat damp from the rain, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said. "I know I didn't send word I was calling." "You're always welcome, Alexander. You know that." Eleanor set down her pen. "Is something wrong?" "No." "Yes. Perhaps." He crossed the room to stand before her, and Eleanor saw that his hands were clenched at his sides, as if he were forcing himself to remain still. "Eleanor, I had planned to do this more formally. I was going to wait for the perfect moment, the ideal setting, but I've realized that's foolish. There is no perfect moment. There's only honesty." He dropped to one knee before her, pulling a small velvet box from his coat pocket. "Eleanor Hartwell, I'm not a romantic man and I won't pretend to be. I can't promise you poetry or grand gestures, but I can promise you honesty, respect, and partnership. I can promise that I will value your intelligence and your opinions, that I will support your interests and ambitions, that I will strive every day to be worthy of your trust." He opened the box, revealing a ring, a sapphire surrounded by diamonds, beautiful and tasteful rather than ostentatiously large. "I love you, Eleanor, not because you're perfect, but because you're real, because you've survived betrayal and emerged stronger, because you challenge me and see me clearly, without illusions. Because being with you makes me want to be better than I am." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "Alexander, let me finish," he said gently. "I know you're afraid. I know William's betrayal made you question your judgment. But Eleanor, your judgment isn't what failed you. William was simply an excellent liar. I'm not. Everything I've shown you is real. Everything I've told you is true. I'm asking you to trust that, to trust me, to trust yourself enough to say yes." He paused, his grey eyes searching her face. "Will you marry me, Eleanor? Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving that you made the right choice?" Eleanor looked at him, this powerful, complex man kneeling before her, offering her everything he had to give. She thought about her father's words, about risk and reward, about the choice between fear and courage. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Yes, Alexander, I'll marry you." The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise, warm and transformative. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose and pulled her into his arms. The kiss was gentle at first, then deeper, full of promise and possibility. When they finally separated, both slightly breathless, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. "Thank you," he said softly, "for trusting me, for giving me a chance. I won't fail you, Eleanor. I swear it." "I know," Eleanor replied, and realized she meant it. The fear hadn't disappeared entirely. Perhaps it never would. But it was overwhelmed by something stronger. Certainty. This was right. He was right. They were right together. The engagement was announced the following week, creating predictable excitement in London society. The wedding was set for August, giving enough time for proper preparation, but not so long as to appear indecisive. Eleanor threw herself into planning with her mother, choosing fabrics and flowers and music. But she also insisted on certain unconventional elements. She wanted meaningful vows rather than just traditional ones, wanted to invite some of the families from her charity work alongside the society guests, wanted the celebration to reflect who she and Alexander actually were, rather than merely social expectations. Alexander supported every decision, even the ones that raised eyebrows among the more conservative members of society. He seemed to delight in Eleanor's determination to make the wedding authentically theirs, rather than a performance for others. Through it all, Eleanor caught glimpses of William and Catherine at various social events. Catherine looked increasingly worn, her smiles forced and her eyes sad. William had gained weight and acquired a florid complexion that suggested too much drinking. The rumors were consistent. He had gambled away much of Catherine's fortune, their marriage was loveless, they maintained separate households within their home. Eleanor should have felt satisfaction, perhaps, but she felt only pity. They had made their choices and were living with the consequences. She had made different choices and was moving toward a different future. 2 weeks before the wedding, a final letter arrived from Catherine. This time, Eleanor read it. "Dear Eleanor, I don't expect you to read this, much less respond, but I needed to write it. Needed to say what I should have said months ago. You were right about everything. William doesn't love me. I don't believe he's capable of loving anyone but himself. He married me for money and I married him for security and status. We were both fools, but I was the greater fool because I betrayed you to get what I wanted. I see now what I destroyed, not just our friendship, though that loss grieves me daily, but my own integrity. I sold my soul for a title and a house, and I've found them both to be prisons. You, meanwhile, have found something real. I've seen you with the Duke, and even at a distance anyone can see the difference. He looks at you the way William never looked at either of us, with genuine respect and affection. You deserve that happiness, Eleanor. You always did. I don't ask for forgiveness, I haven't earned it. I only ask that you believe me when I say I'm truly sorry, and that I'm genuinely happy you found someone worthy of you. May your marriage be everything mine is not." Catherine Eleanor read the letter twice, then carefully folded it and placed it in her writing desk. She would not burn this one. Catherine's apology changed nothing about the past, but it closed a door that had been left painfully open. Eleanor could move forward now without wondering, without what-ifs. That evening she showed the letter to Alexander. He read it silently, his expression thoughtful. "Will you forgive her?" he asked, handing it back. "Eventually, perhaps. Not yet. The wound is still too fresh, but someday I think I might be able to." Eleanor looked at him. "Does that surprise you?" "No. It's one of the things I love about you, your capacity for compassion, even toward those who've hurt you." He pulled her close. "But I confess I'm not as forgiving. William Ashford used and discarded you. I find it difficult to feel charitable toward him." "Then it's good you don't have to forgive him. That's my work, not yours." Eleanor smiled slightly. "Though I admit I enjoy knowing you're protective of me." "Extremely protective," Alexander confirmed. "In fact, I should probably confess something before we're married." Eleanor's heart skipped. "What? Do you remember when your father mentioned that William had been cut off from credit and couldn't secure loans anywhere in London?" "Yes." "That was my doing. I bought up his debts and used my influence to ensure no bank would extend him further credit. I didn't do it out of spite, or at least not entirely. I did it because men like William need to learn that actions have consequences. He used you shamefully, and he shouldn't prosper from that betrayal." Eleanor should have been shocked, perhaps horrified. Instead, she felt a warm rush of something that might have been satisfaction. "You ruined him financially." "I did. Well, he ruined himself. I simply ensured he couldn't avoid the consequences of his own poor decisions." Alexander searched her face. "Are you angry?" "I should be," Eleanor said slowly. "Revenge is supposed to be beneath us, isn't it? We're supposed to turn the other cheek and rise above. Is that what you feel? That you should be angry?" Eleanor thought about it honestly. "No, I feel vindicated. Not because I wanted him to suffer exactly, but because there's justice in it. He calculated that betraying me would bring him wealth and happiness. Instead, it's brought him neither. That feels right somehow. Good, because I'd do it again without hesitation." Alexander's expression was fierce. "You deserved better than what he gave you. I intend to spend our life together, ensuring you receive exactly what you deserve." "And what's that?" "Everything, Eleanor. Absolutely everything." The wedding day arrived with perfect August weather, warm but not oppressively hot, with a gentle breeze and cloudless skies. St. George's Church in Hanover Square was filled to capacity with guests from every level of London society. Eleanor's unconventional guest list meant that wealthy merchants sat alongside aristocrats, charity workers beside politicians, self-made men and women beside those born to privilege. Eleanor stood in the vestibule with her father, her hand resting on his arm, listening to the organ music that signaled the ceremony was about to begin. Her dress was ivory silk, elegantly simple, with minimal ornamentation. She wore Alexander's sapphire ring on her right hand, and in her hair was a wreath of white roses. "Are you ready, my dear?" Thomas asked, his voice thick with emotion. "I am, Papa." And Eleanor realized it was true. The fear that had shadowed her for months had finally lifted. She was about to marry a man she loved, who loved her in return. Not a fantasy love, but a real, complex, honest love built on mutual respect and genuine knowledge of each other. The doors opened. The congregation rose. Helena saw the church filled with faces, some friendly, some merely curious. She saw her mother weeping happily in the front pew. She saw Lady Ashcroft dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, but mostly she saw Alexander waiting at the altar, his face transformed by joy as he watched her approach. His eyes held hers across the length of the church, and in that gaze, Eleanor saw her future, not perfect, but real, not without challenges, but full of partnership and possibility. William and Catherine were not present, of course. Eleanor had not invited them, and they would not have dared come uninvited. But in a way, their absence was its own presence, a reminder of how far Eleanor had come, how much she had survived and overcome. Thomas placed Eleanor's hand in Alexander's, and the Duke's fingers closed around hers with gentle firmness. "Dearly beloved," the Archbishop began, and Eleanor felt Alexander's thumb trace a small circle on her palm, a tiny private gesture of affection amid the public ceremony. The vows were traditional, except for one addition Eleanor had insisted upon. After promising to love and honor and cherish, she added, "I promise to trust you with my heart, even though that trust was once broken. I promise to believe in your integrity, even when fear whispers doubt. I promise to build our future together, not in the shadow of the past, but in the light of who we choose to become." Alexander's voice was steady as he made his own addition. "I promise to earn your trust every day. I promise to be worthy of the gift you've given me. I promise to protect what we're building together with every resource I possess, not because you need protection, but because what we have is too precious to leave undefended." When the Archbishop pronounced them husband and wife, Alexander's kiss was tender and full of promise. The congregation erupted in applause, and as they turned to face their guests, Eleanor saw nothing but happiness and well-wishes, a far cry from the pitying looks and whispers that had followed her months earlier. The reception at Blackwood House was magnificent, elegant but warm, formal but infused with genuine joy. Eleanor danced with her father, with her new husband, with business associates and friends and family members. She laughed more in those few hours than she had in the entire previous year. Late in the evening, as the party continued around them, Alexander pulled Eleanor into a quiet corner of the terrace overlooking the gardens. "Happy, Duchess?" he asked, using her new title for the first time. "Extraordinarily," Eleanor replied, "though I'm still not entirely used to being a duchess." "You wear it well, you wear everything well." Alexander pulled her close. "I have a wedding gift for you beyond the sapphires I gave you this morning." "Alexander, you've already given me too much." "Not nearly enough, but this is different." He handed her a folded document. "This is the deed to William Ashford's debts and properties, all of which I've acquired over the past months. I'm placing them in a trust in your name." Eleanor looked at the papers in confusion. "Why?" "Because you should decide what becomes of him. If you want to extend him mercy to give him a chance to rebuild, you can restructure the debts on manageable terms. If you want justice, you can foreclose and let him face the full consequences of his choices. Either way, the decision is yours, not mine." Eleanor stared at the documents in her hands, understanding the full significance of what Alexander was offering. He had given her power over the man who had hurt her, not to encourage revenge, but to let her choose her own path forward. "What would you do?" she asked. "I'd crush him utterly," Alexander said honestly. "But I'm not the one he wronged. You are. And you're a better person than I am." Eleanor thought about William, the man she'd once believed she loved, now revealed as weak and mercenary. She thought about Catherine's letter, about consequences and second chances, about mercy and justice. "I'll restructure the debts," she said finally, "on reasonable terms that give him a chance to recover if he works hard and lives modestly. But I'll also ensure he can never rise to prominence again, never have the means to hurt someone else the way he hurt me." "Justice tempered with mercy," Alexander observed. "I should have known. Is that disappointing?" "Not at all. It's exactly what I expected from you, and exactly why I love you." He cupped her face in his hands. "You're remarkable, Eleanor Blackwood, and I'm the most fortunate man in England." As they kissed under the stars, the sound of music and laughter drifting from the house behind them, Eleanor realized something profound. William's betrayal, as painful as it had been, had led her to this moment, to this man, to this future. The wound had healed into something stronger, and she had emerged not broken but transformed. She had learned the difference between infatuation and love, between promises and truth, between what glittered and what had actual value. And in learning those lessons, she had found something infinitely more precious than the future she'd once imagined. A partnership built on honesty, a love earned through understanding, and a happiness rooted in reality rather than fantasy. "Shall we return to our guests?" Alexander asked eventually. "In a moment," Eleanor replied, resting her head against his shoulder. "I want to remember this, exactly this moment, how happy I am, how right this feels." "We'll have thousands of moments like this," Alexander promised, "a lifetime of them." And Eleanor, who had learned to be cautious with trust, found herself believing him completely. The autumn sun streamed through the windows of the nursery at Blackwood House, illuminating 2 cribs where infant twins slept peacefully. Eleanor stood beside them, her hand resting on the shoulder of her eldest child, 2-year-old Thomas, who was trying to climb up to see his baby siblings. "Gently, darling," she murmured, lifting him so he could peer into the cribs. "They're sleeping." "Babies," Thomas pronounced with satisfaction, pointing to first one and then the other. "My babies." "Yes, your brother and sister. You're going to be a wonderful big brother." Alexander entered the nursery quietly, crossing to drop a kiss on Eleanor's temple before ruffling his son's dark hair. "How are our little ones?" "Perfect," Eleanor replied, which was objectively untrue. They were normal infants, which meant they cried frequently and slept rarely, but felt emotionally accurate. "How was your meeting with the Factory Reform Committee?" "Productive. Sir Robert believes we'll have enough votes to pass the new legislation next session. Your testimony before the committee last month made a significant impact." Eleanor smiled with satisfaction. The Factory Reform Act, which would limit working hours for children and improve safety conditions, had become one of her passionate causes. As the Duchess of Ashford, she had access and influence she'd never possessed as Miss Hartwell, and she used both strategically on behalf of those who had neither. "I'm speaking at the Women's Education Society tomorrow," she said. "They want to establish a scholarship fund for girls from working families. I thought we might endow it." "An excellent investment," Alexander agreed, which was his way of saying yes to any of Eleanor's charitable projects. He claimed she was spending his fortune faster than he could make it, but he said it with pride rather than complaint. A knock at the door announced Jenkins, who bowed apologetically. "Your Grace, there's a visitor, Mrs. William Ashford." Eleanor and Alexander exchanged glances. It had been nearly 2 years since Eleanor had last seen Catherine. A chance encounter at a charity event, where they had nodded politely to each other, but not spoken. "Show her to the morning room," Eleanor said after a moment's consideration. "I'll be down shortly." When she entered the morning room, she found Catherine standing by the window, looking out at the gardens. She had aged, Eleanor noted. There were lines around her eyes and mouth that hadn't been there 3 years ago, and her dress, though respectable, was not of the latest fashion. "Eleanor," Catherine said, turning. "Thank you for seeing me. I wasn't certain you would." "I almost didn't," Eleanor admitted, gesturing for Catherine to sit. "What brings you here, Catherine?" "I wanted to tell you in person. William and I are separating. Legally, if possible, though it may have to be only a private arrangement. Either way, I'm leaving him." Eleanor absorbed this news without surprise. "I'm sorry your marriage brought you so little happiness." "Are you? I wouldn't blame you if you felt satisfaction instead." Catherine's smile was sad. "I destroyed our friendship for that marriage, and it was never worth the cost." "No," Eleanor agreed, "it wasn't. But I don't take satisfaction in your unhappiness, Catherine. I never wished you ill. I know. That's what makes my betrayal even worse." Catherine twisted her hands in her lap. "I also came to thank you. The trust you established, the restructured debts, they gave William a chance to salvage something. He's wasted it, of course. He's still gambling, still drinking. But that's his choice, not yours. You showed mercy you didn't owe." "I didn't do it for him," Eleanor said quietly. "I did it for myself. I needed to know I could extend grace to someone who'd wronged me. Well, it was more than he deserved. More than I deserved." Catherine stood, smoothing her skirts. "I won't take more of your time. I only wanted you to know that I never stopped regretting what I did, and that I'm genuinely happy you found what you have with the Duke. From what I've heard, you're doing remarkable work. The factory reforms, the education initiatives, the hospital improvements. You're making a real difference." "You could too," Eleanor said impulsively. "If you're separating from William, you'll need purpose, occupation. I could introduce you to the Women's Society. We're always looking for volunteers, particularly those with organizational skills." Catherine's eyes filled with tears. You would do that? After everything? I'm not offering to restore our friendship. That's gone, Catherine, and we both know it. But that doesn't mean I wish you a lifetime of isolation and regret. If you want to make something meaningful of your future, I'll help you. Not for the past, but for the possibility of something better ahead. Thank you, Catherine whispered. I don't deserve such generosity, but I'll try to earn it. After Catherine departed, Eleanor stood at the window for a long moment, thinking about forgiveness and second chances, about how pain could transform into something resembling wisdom. Alexander found her there when he came looking for her an hour later. How was your visitor? Surprising, sad, but perhaps the beginning of something better for her. Eleanor turned into his embrace. I told her I'd help her find meaningful work. I hope that was the right decision. If you made it, I'm certain it was. Your judgment in matters of character has proved remarkably sound. He smiled slightly. Present company excluded, of course. Present company especially included, Eleanor corrected. You were my best decision, Alexander Blackwood. Second best, he replied. Your best decision was choosing to trust yourself again after William's betrayal. I just happened to benefit from it. They stood together in comfortable silence, looking out at the gardens where autumn was painting the trees in gold and amber. Upstairs, one of the twins began crying and they could hear the nurse's footsteps hurrying to attend. We should go help, Eleanor said, but she made no move to leave the circle of Alexander's arms. In a moment, he replied, echoing words she'd spoken on their wedding night. I want to remember this, exactly this moment, how happy I am, how right this feels. We'll have thousands of moments like this, Eleanor promised, using his own words back to him. A lifetime of them. And as they climbed the stairs together toward their children's cries and their future's promises, Eleanor reflected on the strange journey that had brought her here. She had been courted for 3 years by a man who married her best friend the very next day. It had nearly broken her, but from that breaking had come something stronger, a clearer understanding of her own worth, a more honest assessment of what real love required, and ultimately a partnership with someone who saw her truly and loved her completely. William had taught her what she didn't want. Alexander had shown her what was possible. And if that wasn't its own form of perfect justice, Eleanor didn't know what was. The past could not be changed. The betrayal had happened, and its scars would always remain. But those scars were part of her story now, part of what had shaped her into who she had become, someone stronger, wiser, and infinitely more capable of recognizing true value when she found it. She had been courted falsely and abandoned cruelly. But she had been avenged, not through schemes or revenge, but through the simple act of building something genuine and good. William lived with the consequences of his choices, as did Catherine, and Eleanor lived with hers, the choice to trust again, to love again, to believe in the possibility of happiness even after heartbreak. It was, she thought as she lifted her crying daughter from the cradle, a far better ending than any she might have imagined 3 years ago. Actually, it wasn't an ending at all. It was simply the beginning of everything that truly mattered. The end.